I wrote a dissertation on EWPC and the concept of ecstasis. For the last 2 years, I've assisted research concerning religious experience at Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry. This panel is an event honoring D.T. Suzuki's achievements, not only as the one who introduced Zen to the West, but also for his special contribution to the EWPC at the University of Hawaii. He participated in the first conference in 1939, and then in 1949, 1959, and 1964. His Columbia University lectures in the 50s introduced a generation of thinkers and artists to Zen, and were attended by, for instance, the musician John Cage and the artist Agnes Martin. I will briefly introduce our three panelists. Tomoe Maria taught at Hannan University and joined Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture in 2021. She specializes in the intellectual history of modern Japanese Buddhism, particularly Zen, Suzuki, Suzuki, and Jodo Shin Buddhism. Her research covers the globalization of Japanese Buddhism from a cross-border perspective that connects modern Japanese history with Asian American history. Her recent works include Issei Buddhism in the Americas and selected works of D.T. Suzuki, Volume 3, Comparative Religion. There are works.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Ben, for this beautiful way and also kind introduction. And my name is Tomoe Moria from Nanzan University. I just arrived yesterday morning, and so I'm still suffering from jet lag, but I hope I can finish it in time. Okay, so my title of my presentation is D.T. Suzuki's Wartime Trauma and Post-War Hawaii. He's visiting the first and second East-West Philosophers Conferences. And I will just read my paper, and there's no PowerPoint slides, so I'm sorry about inconvenience. Okay. Let me start my presentation. In his long 96-year life, Daisetsu Keitaro Suzuki encountered many personal and national traumas, that is, the deaths of loved ones and friends, as well as several wars, including the one with the United States. Today, I'd like to discuss Suzuki's wartime traumas from the 1930s to 1940s, and argue that his writings on personal trauma reveal his views on social and national problems. At the same time, the discourses, including public lectures on national sufferings, revolved around Buddhist views against war. I discuss both the personal and national traumas of Suzuki to illustrate him as a human being experiencing desperate feelings and resentment during wartime, not just an aloof older man with thick eyebrows and a gentle smile. The 1930s and 40s are marked by rising militarism and nationalism in Japan during the 15-year war in the Asia Pacific. Previous studies on Suzuki's Zen Buddhism focus on his war efforts, nationalist reactions, reverse Orientalist discourses, and even depicted him as pro-Nazi. However, I aim to present a more nuanced view of Suzuki, drawing from newly found materials. Through this paper, I delve into the two types of wartime traumas he experienced and the complex way in which he reacted to them before eventually joining to post-war America. By re-examining his works, diaries, and newly found letters in English and Japanese, we can uncover how historical backgrounds influenced his Buddhist thought. Unlike other Meiji-born men who tended to be conservative and patriarchal, Suzuki was an exceptionally feminist-leaning Buddhist. His openness was evident in his marriage to Beatrice Lane, an American woman with a keen interest in Eastern thought and Buddhism. The following sentence, penned by Suzuki at the age of 70, resonates with the emotional depth of his experiences. Quote, "We agree that our aim for living together should be to propagate Eastern thoughts, or what may be called Eastern feelings, among the people in Europe and America from the beginning of our marriage. It would be delightful if our efforts made a better understanding of Eastern and Western cultures possible, even if it was only minor progress. Honestly though, from a view of our innermost feelings, we were happy to discuss our impressions, thoughts, and insights and eventually put them into sentences. We were not so much interested in the superficial result of achieving something." Unquote. This quote comes from Suzuki's preface to the memoirs of his deceased wife Beatrice, called A Small Sketch of Buddhism by Blue Lotus, published in 1940. Beatrice passed away in July 1939, which was why Suzuki did not attend the first East-West Philosophers Conference. Suzuki wrote to Greg Sinclair, quote, "As I believe you are already informed by this time by Professor Charles Moore, my wife's illness may prevent my coming to Honolulu in June 1979, unquote. She had been periodically hospitalized since March 1938, and he visited her at the hospital whenever he could, almost every day. In addition to being a caring person, what is impressive about Suzuki's preface is that he reminisced that the couple was not so interested in the superficial result or achievement. Rather, they simply enjoyed discussing things with each other. Although they were already known for the publication of the journal Eastern Buddhist, which contained many Zen articles and translations of the Mahayana canon by Suzuki, the loss of Beatrice was quite significant to Daisetsu Keitaro. The loss of the loved ones was so significant that on May 1941, he wrote in his diary, quote, "Not to see B, that's Beatrice, anymore here in Kyoto, who used to greet me at the door whenever returning from Kamakura, makes my heart sink, filled with very, very sad thoughts. But in a way, I am glad that she's no more here when times are so bad and hard for every one of us, especially as I'm sure sad for you, dearest Beatrice. I shall join you soon." Unquote. Although he would not join her for another 25 years, we can see his agony of lonesomeness under the stained diplomacy with the United States, where his wife was born. He met her while living there in the 1900s. It was only 7 months before Japan entered the war with America by making a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Suzuki chronicled with vexation on December 8, 1941, quote, Japanese-American Conference reported failure. State of war between Japan and America and England declared in the western parts of the Pacific. Human powers altogether helpless to shape their own course of action. Radio news disturbing. Unquote. His grandniece Kumino recalled Suzuki's anger when he heard the news. Quote, "It will surely be a disaster if Japan starts a war with America. The military junta does not recognize what they should do. We must get rid of the military personnel." Unquote. Speaking of personal trauma, he also lost his lifetime friends consecutively. Yamamoto Ryokichi in July 1942 and Nishida Kitaro in June 1945. His diary on June 7, 1945 reads, quote, "A telephone message received from Nishida's saying that he died at 4 a.m. rather unexpectedly after a short illness. Not to say anything about my personal loss, his death is a great loss to Japan when the war is approaching to an end. Either way, defeat or long war, too bad." Unquote. Suzuki foresaw Japan's defeat and the end of World War II approaching as early as June 1945. It is not that he was a prophet, but rather that he could realistically perceive the war situation with a fair estimation of the military and economic power of the United States against Japan. Following the Nanjing massacre in 1937 to 1938, Suzuki wrote to his Dharma brother Senzaki Myogen in Los Angeles to send him a copy of Reader's Digest articles covering the hideous incident. The news was highly censored in Imperial Japan, and particular articles were unavailable, so Suzuki tried to at least 3 times acquire the correct information from overseas. The question is, what made this realistic perspective possible? I argue that personal trauma and what may be called national sufferings, namely the Asia-Pacific War, as well as rising nationalism and militarism in Japan, impacted Suzuki. For him, personal and national sufferings became intertwined, and his discourses in the 1930s and 40s reflect how he struggled to find paths to healing the wounds. Therefore, this paper provides a historical analysis of his Buddhist thoughts in a critical situation. Let us chronologically overview Suzuki's discourses, including a public lecture which reflects his ideas on contemporary social issues in the 30s and 40s. He attended the World Congress of Faith in London in 1936, which Sir Francis Younghusband organized. The former British Army officer hosted the Interfaith Conference, hoping to overcome an exclusive hold on truth in each religion when the diplomatic relations gradually deteriorated in Europe. Suzuki delivered a speech titled "Ignorance and World Fellowship." Among the intellectuals and clergy who presented their papers at the Congress, he was one of the few participants who did not discuss religion within a monotheistic framework. He also emphasized the characteristics of Buddhism that distinguish it from other faiths instead of discussing superficial common features. Suzuki began his talk by describing the ignorance inherent in every human being. Quote, "To To state that action starts from ignorance, or that dependent on ignorance there is action, means that the world where we live and carry on our business is the product of ignorance. The aim of the Buddhist discipline is to overcome ignorance, which is also freeing ourselves from karma and all its consequences, quote, unquote. Instead of presenting positive, idealistic ideas on world fellowship through religion, he first raised the question of human mindset and how ignorance causes discrimination and hinders human mind from achieving enlightenment. With the Western oversimplification of and the misunderstanding of nirvana as a death in mind, he explained, quote, to seek enlightenment by negating the world. A world of birth and death is really a deception. Buddhism accepts life as it is, with its dualism, its evils, its struggles, its pains, in fact, everything that makes it up. Unquote. Ignorance, in this sense, was not just a lack of knowledge, but also a reality of misperception familiar to everyone. Suzuki described it as, quote, regarding this dualism as final and clinging to it as the basis of our communal life. This logically and emotionally ends in egotism and all the evils following from its assertion. Buddhism asks us to gain an insight into that which underlies all forms of dualism and thereby not to be attached to them and irreducibly final, unquote. Assuming that most particular participants are Christian, Suzuki elaborated that emptiness, or shunyata, was neither God nor the capitalized universal, and was not to be conceived as atheistically or nor pantheistically, or cosmistically, unquote. Such seemingly redundant negation may sound clumsy by today's standards, but they would likely have spurred the audience of the 1930s to question their concept of religion. Speaking of non-duality, Suzuki explained shunyata with a dualistic worldview using a formula of equality in difference in equality. 平等即差別、差別即平等 in Japanese. He explained that 平等 or equality means evenness or sameness, whereas 差別 means individuality, particularity, or multiplicity. Therefore, shunyata, which he defined as equality, is that, quote, which lies underneath pluralistic existences, unquote. Furthermore, although individuals always remain individuals in a dualistically conditioned world, they are not the same in that sense, in the sense that you are I and I am you. For you and I are antithetical, and the merging into each other is the end of the world. But this does not mean that there is no bridging between the two terms. For if there were no bridging, there would be no mutuality, and consequently no communal life, unquote. In other words, he interpreted the formula as each person or religion having equal value yet diverse features. As such, how can we understand one another and live our communal life in peace in this realistically conditioned world more meaningfully in a Buddhist way? The answer was the work of love, or karuna in a Buddhist term. As a promoter of non-dualism, Suzuki did not separate the spirit from the material and instead discussed how religion could engage in communal life, because the Buddhist final goal was not to retreat to remote mountains as a hermit. Although he regarded substance or matter as being able to help us grow stronger in spiritual power, and therefore we feel fellowship and mutuality, he warned that love without realizing one's own ignorance could be harmful from a Buddhist point of view. Suzuki continued his discussion on Buddhist social engagement as follows. Quote, as to the management of the so-called material world, together with our communal life, national and international, which is based on matter, it is left to the best judgment of worldly wise people. The only direction Buddhism can give them is to remind them of the truth that as long as ignorance, taken in its widest possible sense, has a firm hold of us, we are never able to rise above its most undesirable and most deplorable consequences. All these consequences are, in fact, the outcome of love wrongly directed by ignorance. Unquote. Although this may seem defeatist and unsatisfactory from an activist-minded perspective, it was inevitable considering his vehement opposition to the political maneuvering of religion, and in the case of official Shinto, which was highly colored with political and military motives. Instead, what Buddhists could tell the worldly people was that public-spiritedness is, quote, all very well as far as it goes, but when it implies egotism of a fierce kind and tends to exclusiveness at all costs, we know where it finally ends. We are just witnessing it practically demonstrated all over the world. Unquote. Regarding social issues, one of his socialist-leaning essays published in the 1930s can help us better understanding his intentions. His 1930 essay on poverty promoted guaranteeing a fair social welfare system and the equal distribution of wealth, which is understandable given his sympathy towards socialism in his youth and the Japanese Marxist challenge from the anti-religious movements in the early 1930s. He called for free tuition and medical care, equal pensions, sanitary infrastructure, public health and health care coverage, and even the prohibition of private land ownership. According to Suzuki, quote, the best way to truly fight poverty is to end poverty itself. I think religion's role is to encourage us to think about how we can find a way out. We can also end war if we want. It happens due to a lack of a religious mind. Out of the budget for war and armaments, we can accumulate quite an amount of money. Raising the same amount within a few years is possible by improving our social life. Unquote. Therefore, Suzuki believed that one of religion's crucial jobs was to let the whole world realize how desirable it is to be free from poverty and make progress toward disarmament and persuading people how absurd war is. Unquote. At the end of the speech, Suzuki suggested that one possible solution would be establishing a world fellowship of faith that, quote, a free communication of all kinds among religiously aspiring people of different nations, unquote. He proposed this fellowship as being independent of existing political bodies and institutions, hinting that these have no visible achievement even after the Naval Disarmament Conference or the establishment of the League of Nations, of which Japan had been a charter member until 1933, because our common hindrance still weighs on us too heavily. He concluded the post-talk discussion as follows. Mere talking does not do much good, but our coming together does a great deal. You're seeing my face and my seeing yours. That does some good. Somehow, arrangement must be made so that we can assemble wherever we want and whenever we want. Unless we can do, the world fellowship is nothing but talking. We must have these kinds of gatherings so that it's in the streets of London they shall know that our Parliament for Peace is meeting here. Considering the reason for such an aspiration for free discussion, it is crucial to notice that he witnessed the emergence of an era of terrorism, namely the attempted coup d'etat in Japan to establish an ultra-nationalist junta in February 1936. A group of army officers of the Imperial Way faction influenced the propaganda of the Showa Restoration, led by more than 1,000 military personnel and assassinated cabinet members and others, while wounding several more. Suzuki's diaries following the February 26 incident reveals how he felt uneasy about the terrible political coup d'etat. In another speech, maybe I should skip some of the sentences. So I would like to skip some pages and talk about Japanese spirituality and war. Suzuki published Japanese Spirituality in 1944. This book was one of his well-known yet controversial book, which scholars have mixed evaluations. As James Dobbins pointed out, Suzuki carefully detailed why he chose the term Reisei instead of Seishin, which was much more popular then. English translation of the two words can be spirituality, while Japanism, Nihonshugi, or more precisely Japanese nationalism, was almost synonymous with Nihon Seishin, Japanese spirit. As a historian, Tsuda Sokichi witnessed, the ambiguous term Nihon Seishin trended in the 1930s. Still, because it spread during political turmoil, the related propaganda tended to exaggerate and was sometimes grimly oppressive. Although Tsuda was not explicit, the Showa Restoration movement drove the Nihon Seishin ideology, eventually leading to the February 26 incident. A Marxist philosopher, Hosaka Jun, more explicitly critical of the Nihon Seishin ideology, also noted the term's ambiguity and nationalistic characteristics. Considering this contemporary analysis of Seishin, it is understandable that Suzuki explained the difference between the two. Whereas Seishin is based in the discriminatory consciousness, Reisei is non-discriminatory wisdom. It is noteworthy that he also wrote highly of Reisei if we want the rivalries of the existing dualistic worldview to cease and become conciliatory and fraternal, and mutual interpretation and self-identity to prevail. We have no choice but to await the awakening of man's religious consciousness, they say. When Suzuki dealt with what was the most essential in religion, he often mentioned the first verse of the four great vows of Bodhisattva. However numerous the sentient beings, I vow to save them, which is Shujo Muhen Seigando. In the last half of the first edition, then of the Diamond Sutra, he ended the book with the four great vows. The post-war edition, sorry. Suzuki had to write something about this Bodhisattva's vow during the time of auto-nationalism and devastating war. Quote, "First, I would like to think this way. Instead of separating myself from others and asking for sympathy by saying, I am this way and that they are that way. I and others are not separated from the beginning. I prefer to think we have a kind of true nature that transcends our division, which works upon all of us. Shujo Muhen Seigando is a work of the great compassion that responds to the sufferings of our existence in general and the sufferings of the world and universe, not separately feeling the pain of others and mine with a discriminatory mind. Great wisdom finds sufferings of the universe, and we can free from them by active work of the great compassion. Thus, spirituality is Suzuki's most substantial religious consciousness. Unlike I think it's over. What's my? I'm sorry, I could not finish my paper, but I would like to say that he concluded those asking the kind of question he raised during the wartime is, I think there's something we can that's a question that raised to us, and something thrown at us in the us living in 21st century. So that's all for my paper.
Hein is a professor of religious studies, a history and founding director of the Asian Studies program at Florida International University, a specialist on the history and thought of Zen Master Dogen. Hein has published over 30 books, 37, I think, on various aspects of the origins of Chan and Zen in China and its spread to medieval and modern Japan. He is also the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun Award from the Japanese government. The recent book is titled Like Cats and Dogs, Contesting the Moon Koan in Zen Buddhism, and I believe that his talk is based on this recent work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to the organizers of this panel, and I'd like to thank my old friend Steve Oden for his current research on D.T. Suzuki, my co-panelist who just gave a fascinating talk. And I'd also like to say a few words about Richard Jaffe, who was originally scheduled for today's panel. And unfortunately, Richard had a family health issue. His sister was unfortunately succumbing from cancer and passed away about a week ago. So Richard was unable to make it here today. And he emailed me that he recalled that, as Professor Moria mentioned, that D.T. Suzuki in 1939 was caring for his wife, Beatrice, who was ill from cancer. So there's a kind of connection there, unfortunately. I want to say a few words about Richard Jaffe's current research, because he was the main editor of the 4-volume series, the Selected Works of D.T. Suzuki, that came out a few years ago. Richard is working on a huge biography of Suzuki that he's been researching for many years, and is midway in the writing process, and is going to be going to Japan for more research in the next couple of months. But meanwhile, he has another project that is going to be published probably within a year by Columbia University Press. And what this project does is take 6 lectures that Suzuki gave at Columbia University in 1952, 1953, when he gave a series of lectures that was so fascinating to many different artists, musicians, intellectuals, mystics from all over who flocked to his lecture series on Friday afternoons at Columbia University in the early 1950s. And in addition to presenting an edited version of the transcripts from the lectures, Jaffe's book will have a lengthy introductory essay where he talks about the social, historical implications of the impact that Suzuki had on so many people from that era. So my topic today concerns one particular aspect of Suzuki's work, which is the famous Mu Koan, in which, or the Wu Gong'an in Chinese, in which the monosyllabic word mu is used as the main device to lead people from an experience of intense anxiety as a form of trauma or self-doubt into an experience of an illumined state of mind that reconciles polarities and creates a breakthrough to an experience of non-dual reality. And I want to read from an anecdote that is kind of typical of the stories that Suzuki would often quote about Zen practitioners in the practice of the Mu Koan, and how it was considered the single main device, the one-syllable device to lead from intense doubt to a breakthrough experience of Satori. And this anecdote is from a modern Japanese Zen context, in which a teacher typically was very notorious for being demanding, domineering, scolding students in public, and reprimanding them for not practicing. And so the student in this case said, "My hard heart was shut tight, leaving me without a soul in the whole world to turn to after having suffered some of the reprimands of this domineering teacher." But that was done on purpose to break down the ego, to force the student to confront their self-doubt and to have the breakthrough experience. Then, during the meditation practice and in between the formal practices, the disciple says, "I went out into the yard, quietly sat down before the temple. One great tree stood alone, reaching to the clouds. In harmony with my chant of Mu, 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 the earth trembled and urged me on. Azalea leaves and small flowers spoke to me one by one." And they go on to say that as they were sitting there contemplating Mu, a tiny insect flew by and the door, and it was Mu. An airplane flew overhead, it was Mu. The whole universe was nothing but Mu. In the midst of this, the wooden frame of the paper door fell away and vanished, and so on in the experience of Satori. So in the presentation of the Mu Koan in the 20th century, two main Japanese figures were important. One was the scholar, the historian at Kyoto University, Yanagita Seizan, who helped to kind of revolutionize Zen historiographical studies by examining the Song Dynasty texts in China that were the basis for so many koans and recorded sayings of eminent Zen masters. And of course, the other main figure in the 20th century who promoted the importance of the Mu koan was D.T. Suzuki, who made this a centerpiece of his wide-ranging discussion of how Sino-Japanese koan texts should be studied in their historical context, but also how you could present them in a contemporary way that dovetailed with the arts, with comparative mysticism and psychology and philosophy, and he tried to use so many different Western paradigms and in order to present and promote the importance of the Mu koan and other traditional Zen texts. According to Nishitani Keiji, who was associated with Suzuki's lifelong friend Nishida Kitaro, the founder of the Kyoto School of Japanese philosophy, Suzuki's work centering on the transmission of Buddhism was, quote, fully immersed in Zen's long tradition, but at the same time was conversant with contemporary standpoints to reframe this as relevant to today's world. Furthermore, Nishida said that pointed out that Suzuki communicated his message not only through books and lectures, but also through direct, impromptu, personal interactions by encouraging and answering questions wherever he went. In such settings, through edifying others with his presence, perhaps even more so than his words, Suzuki offered an open, embodied access to the experience of Zen. And going back to Richard Jaffe's work, this is what his essay to the Columbia Lecture Series will show very vividly. So Suzuki contributes to the discourse concerning the role of the Mu koan is an understanding of the explosive breakthrough experience that occurs from contemplating the case, which is often accompanied by the bitter taste of mental or physical breakdown. Suzuki also connects the path of absolute negation that is realized in an intensely personal way, or an experience of the apophatic viewpoint with the distinctive Zen affirmation of everyday reality as the locus of ultimate truth, which is a kind of utmost cataphotic view. To consider the importance of the koan from a kind of indirect standpoint, as Zen texts often guide us, I'm reminded of a Japanese Zen poet, medieval Japanese Zen poet monk who said, it's more difficult to grow an orchid than it is to attain enlightenment. A saying which highlights the complexity of the spiritual quest in that the exotic flower was a Chinese symbol for cultivating a virtue despite obstacles. But another Zen saying that I'd like to cite is, the greater one's experience of doubt, the greater one's experience of enlightenment. And I think this is kind of the key to Suzuki's presentation. In other words, profound underlying feelings of anxiety, turmoil, and despair, which get aggravated at a particular moment or in a particular situation by a strong, immediately present sense of frustration, futility, and instability, and incomprehensibility, which is what the teacher often tries to instruct in the disciple. That represents a necessary stage in the process of exposing the roots of attachment and delusion. As explained by Suzuki's extensive coverage and intricate analysis of how koans function, or we could say how to do things with koans, within the broader project of identifying and resolving the roots of doubt, a deeply exacerbated sense of anxiety in turn fosters the conditions for attaining a spontaneous turnaround experience that unlocks the door to awakening from barriers created by self-imposed ignorance and deception. Now, to use another famous Zen story that highlights this dynamic of doubt, and the greater the doubt, the greater the enlightenment, let me talk about the story for a minute of a monk named Shangyan, a Tang Dynasty monk, who was who they say had struggled to gain enlightenment for over 30 years, and the teacher always reprimanded that student for being stuck on scriptures, stuck on the written word, and not having a personal breakthrough. And then it's recorded and commented on many times in poetry and paintings that Sheng Yan was sweeping a rock in the garden when one of the pebbles struck a nearby bamboo tree, and hearing the ping sound led to a sudden realization. So suffering the severe humiliation from the teacher helped promote the advent of a final release. As suggested by a commentary cited by Suzuki, the trainee's traumatic position is like that of a dog that stands by a pot where fat is boiling. On some level, the dog knows better than to lick the pot, however badly he wants to, but he cannot simply leave it alone either, even though he wishes to quit it. This desperate situation also resembles sitting on a seat of thorns in an inescapable Vajra cage. But when doubt gets extended to the utmost extreme standpoint, then a proverbial somersault or radical reversal that leads to awakening becomes possible. And the somersault imagery is frequently used in the explanation of how the koans work from a psychological standpoint. Traditionally, it is said that the koan corpus consists of 17 entries, but there are actually hundreds more than that. That's kind of an arbitrary number to symbolize a lot of them. But in the end, according to many forms of practice, only one is necessary, and that could be the mu, it could be other examples, but the mu is often considered the koan of koans, according to a modern commentator, Akazuki Liuman, and for John Daido Lori, a famous American Zen practitioner, he said, all the rest of the koan system of the thousands of cases are simply a process of refining what's originally seen in the one word mu. And for the Taiwanese master Sheng Yan, who died some years ago, the mu koan was the ideal teaching tool for shattering the great doubt, in the most clear-cut, the easiest case to use, and the most effective of all the koan records. So the mu koan is the single best-known case. But one thing I want to point out, and I don't have time to go into it in detail today, is that there's an alternative answer, which is yes, and that's often overlooked. And actually, if you track down the original records, and this is attributed to Tang Dynasty master Jiao Zhou, if you track down the original, earliest recorded statements about it, there's actually a combined answer, yes and no, and both have a brief expository comment, and those comments are paradoxical, but it shows that there's an intricacy and complexity to the original discourse that over the course of time somehow got shortcutted and reduced, and that became a standard viewpoint in Zen. But I like to just point out that there's another side of the story as well. But the focus on the mu koan as a single syllable, as one device packed into just a single sound, was primarily promoted by the Sung Dynasty Ninji school Chan master Dahui, and he referred to this as the keyword or the punchline or the capping phrase. In one form of his teaching, and again it's complicated because there are alternative approaches that he himself suggested, but Dahui was known for saying, stick to the mu, and he used the following expressions. Now devote yourself to this koan and try to find its meaning. Devote yourselves to it day and night, whether sitting or lying, whether walking or standing. Devote yourselves to its solution during the entire course of 24 hours, even when dressing or taking meals or attending to your natural needs. Have your every thought fixed on the mu koan. But even there, it gets a little complicated because Hakuin, the Edo period Japanese Zen master, raised a series of 20 checking questions, and he said that we can't take for granted that when you supposedly solve the mu, that's the end of the story. You have to be checked and double checked, and then there's a series of queries that the teacher is supposed to present. to verify that the experience was genuine and long-lasting. So, next question I'd like to ask is, what does Zhao Zhou's answer, mu, mean? Literally, of course, it means there is no Buddha nature, or the dog lacks it, or lacks the Buddha nature. This is an enigmatic misdirection that reflects a disdain for the inquiry, rather than an outright rejection, probably, of the orthodox doctrinal standpoint of Mahayana Buddhism, that the Buddha nature is universal. According to Zhao Zhou, by cleverly, what he's basically trying to do is to dissuade, distract people from their misimpressions, rather than to offer an alternative viewpoint. And so the negative answer mu is a way of kind of disdaining, distancing from, without necessarily rejecting, and without offering an alternative that would be affirmed and could become a source of attachment. So one main concern is that the mu itself does not become the source of an attachment to vacuity, nihility, absence, or lack, and that it's understood as a kind of transcendental position beyond the yes and no. So maybe there were yes and no answers, but couldn't they be encompassed and transcended at the same time in the single syllable? That's the position that Dahui and many others throughout history have promoted. So that the mu is not a typical negation, but it's what absolute negation, or what modern Kyoto school philosophers have called absolute nothingness, that is cutting off and discarding delusions without promoting an alternative that would be a form of attachment. There were many figures in Chinese and Japanese Zen history who have endorsed Dahui's standpoint, and connected that to an understanding of the term koan in the legal sense, because the term koan was borrowed from the Chinese judicial system to refer to public cases or case records in a legal sense, and here they're applied in, with a spiritual symbolism of resolving the person's great doubt. So, some interpreters try to imagine an original scene. Other interpreters say don't imagine anything, don't think about it in concrete terms, but I like to think that, what happened with Zhao Zhou and his disciple originally, maybe they were in the courtyard of the temple, and maybe a stray dog came by, and the teacher and the student, just simply said, "Oh, what about this dog?" And let's keep in mind that in those days, in the Buddhist monasteries in China, cats were highly prized because they could devour some of the pests, but they were also good companions for the monks, whereas the dogs probably at that time were not considered pets, but they were able to not only ward off pests, but they could ward off bandits or pirates that might invade the monastery. So they were prized, but not valued as much as the cats. But that's another rabbit hole I won't go into. But the point is, can we imagine there was a kind of crime scene where the disciple makes this question, and Zhao Zhou has to immediately dissuade the disciple, hey, let's not ask that question to begin with. It's an inevitable question, it's an obvious question, and for those very reasons, it's not the question you should even be asking. So I'm just going to say move to just take away, pull the rug out from under you without trying to offer an affirmation. We can imagine that he might have said yes, but also without trying to affirm a particular viewpoint. As Robert Beltswell has pointed out in his studies of how the Mu Koan works in Korean Buddhism, there's an idea that the sensation of doubt has to be heightened to the breaking point. So whether or not the dog was present in actuality or conceptuality, over the centuries, both monastic and lay practitioners have been assigned the case and always told, meditate on it 24/7, whether walking or sleeping or lying down. Don't ever let up from that task. Now, I think there's a fascinating example of this in a story by the famous early 20th century Japanese writer Natsume Soseki. And he had a collection of short stories called 10 Night Streams. And in one of those stories, a samurai who's training in Zen is told by his master that he's not making it, he's not getting close to enlightenment, so just meditate on Mu until you get there. And so the master has a one-night vigil, and he's thinking about Mu, and then there was a film version of this that came out in 2007, which was the 100th anniversary of Suzuki's original book. And in the film version, there's this, the ideographed Mu is hanging up on a painting, on a calligraphy, above the person's head. He's staring at it and sweating and trying to keep from jumping out of his skin, so to speak. And then eventually, by the end of the night, he feels he's a dismal failure. However, he's challenged in sword fighting, and he is able to react in an instantaneous, spontaneous, thoroughly effective way. And so his teacher said, hey, you did it after all, even though you didn't even realize that you had done it. You had the breakthrough experience. There's many other stories of the dynamics of how the case record works out. For example, there was a famous Zen teacher at Daitokuji Temple in Kyoto in the mid-20th century who was particularly renowned for his koan commentaries, but especially for giving his practitioners the Mu koan case. And he was told that the disciples were told, become one with the Mu, die the great death of the ego, of the self, thinking, I am Mu, all is Mu, etc. And sometimes there's a kind of triumphalist attitude that by reflecting on the Mu, the breakthrough will take place and will be recognized by the teacher. But a lot of times it's not so easy. So there's a great scene in a film called Land of the Disappearing Buddha, which was part of a documentary series about world religions made back in the 1970s, in which Yamada Roshi at Daitokuji Temple was seen interviewing disciples who were practicing the Mu koan, and so he has one disciple who, in this process, what they call the sanzen, where the students would line up and he'd take them one by one, and he might dismiss them by ringing the bell after a few moments, or he might linger on longer with them, depending on the needs, the pedagogical needs of the particular student. So in this one example that they show in the film, the student there comes in, sits down, and growls. It seems like from the bottom of his being, wholeheartedly growls Mu, and when they transcribe it, they put 17 U's in it for effect, so we can really feel like Mu. And I think when you watch it, you feel like, okay, this guy's made it very obviously, and of course the teacher just scornfully dismisses him and says, like, you have to say it from deep within you. You can't just utter the words with your lips, and rings the bell and dismisses him. So that the Mu, even though it's one syllable and it can be very simple and quick, and an effective device can be something that can take weeks, months, or more to resolve. Let me. How much time is there? Okay, so let me talk briefly about the famous figure Nishida Kutaro, who was friends apparently from the 4th grade class that they shared with the Suzuki, both growing up in the town of Kanazawa in the medieval town of Kanazawa that they grew up in northwest Japan. And Nishida, famous for his philosophy of absolute nothingness, and probably based to a large extent on his own personal experiences of Mu, according to his biography, failed miserably with the Mu koan early in his career. So he was assigned the Mu when he was practicing at Yoshinji Temple in Kyoto in 1897, and kind of gave it up. because he wasn't making any progress. And then he, a few years later, he studied with a different Zen teacher who once again assigned him the Mu, and there was another colleague in his cohort who also had the Mu, and they started at the same time, and they were on the same trajectory, and Nishida was not making it. And the teacher kept telling him, you're not getting over the temptation of thinking about it, rationalizing it, philosophizing about it. And meanwhile, the other student went ahead and quickly passed the Mu koan, and Suzuki was disillusioned and downhearted for months afterwards. A lot of this is recorded in a biography of Nishida by, intellectual biography of Nishida by Michiko Yusa. So not only did Nishida feel like he failed with the Mu, but he saw his colleague race ahead of him and succeed with it, and he was he experienced a kind of jealousy, and he was reluctant to continue with koan training. But Suzuki was destined to be the philosopher, not necessarily the Zen teacher that. Nishida was destined to be the philosopher, not the Zen teacher that Suzuki was. And so when he published one of his first books, A Study of Good, he was able to start documenting the distinction between absolute nothingness and relative nothingness. And he could articulate the significance of Mu from a philosophical standpoint that apparently he himself felt disappointed that he wasn't able to experience it personally. Some of his followers, including Nishitani, would talk about the standpoint of subjective nothingness, of experiencing yes and no answers at the same time, that they are both transcended, so that the dichotomy is wiped away. One question I think that we can raise is there a continuity from Dahui in the 12th century China through the medieval Japanese period, the Edo period in Japan, and modern American practitioners such as John Daido Loori, Taiwanese practitioners, and Korean, and also the Kyoto school philosophers Nishida and Nishitani, among others? Are they having a similar viewpoint? Now, because of my own personal research interest in Dogen, I'm going to have to bring Dogen in here a little bit, because Dogen comments very frequently on the Mu koan, but he tends to favor the mixed case, meaning the yes and no answer is what he's presenting. And Dogen is known for a philosophy that's sometimes referred to as kato, which is the Japanese word for entanglements, and it means like working through entanglements by virtue of entanglements, like letting the entanglements unfold. So it's a little bit different version from Dahui's view and the typical view that I think Suzuki was presented, which is often known as wato, which is where you have the Mu as the key word, the head word, the capping phrase, and the Mu is it. So I look at two different interpretations, the wato, which is the single syllable, and the kato, where you have multiplicity of a variety of answers coming and going. Which one is more satisfactory and effective as a teaching tool, that remains to be seen. But there's kind of two philosophical interpretations that I like to present, where I appreciate and admire what Suzuki presented, but I also have to be loyal to Dogen, and that standpoint is an alternative. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they kind of exist side by side. And let me wrap up by briefly talking about another modern scholar who I think Professor Moriya also mentioned, Ogawa Takeshi, who deals a lot with koan interpretations, ranging from the Chan text, because he's a sinologist in Japan, to Suzuki and contemporary interpretations. And Ogawa says we need to consider that that the doctrine of the Buddha nature has to be juxtaposed with the doctrine of self-realization, or the practice of self-realization, and that Zen is always based on finding the right balance. And so all these teaching tools and interpretations of Mu, koan, and other cases are trying to find the balance that neither one becomes a source of attachment, that they both reflect and enhance one another, that is the universal Buddha nature and self-doubt, self-realization. And I won't go into all the details, but he kind of tracks the history of the different interpretations of Zen in China, and then also talks about how some Japanese interpreters appropriated those different versions. So I will conclude here by saying that Ogawa points out that there's the sudden path, the absolute breakthrough based on absolute negation, and then there is the more gradual path of that is another way of saying what I referred to a moment ago as Wato, the capping phrase, versus Kanto, or considering all the implications and varieties of interpretation. So thank you very much.
Aloha everybody. Thank you for waking up so early and supporting the panel. My talk is called Trauma and Healing in the Zen Aestheticism of P.T. Suzuki. It's a very long paper, so I won't read it to you. I'll just, in an extemporaneous stream of consciousness way, communicate this to you. I wrote this a long time ago. What did I say? Oh yeah. Generally speaking, for Mahayana Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, trauma is dukkha, suffering. And that covers psychological and existential trauma, for example, and the ecological suffering of the environmental crisis, many kinds. So I'm approaching this from multiple perspectives. I'll deal with three major approaches. In the first part, I'll talk about planetary trauma of ecological crisis from environmental nature. The second part goes to the psychological and existential trauma. And the third part, well, this makes a very interesting connection between D.T. Suzuki Zen and the most famous Jungian psychologist in Japan, Kawai Hayao, and the best-selling Japanese novelist of all time, Murakami Haruki. Through the writings of Kawai Hayao, the Jungian psychologist, this link between Suzuki and Murakami Haruki is made. So in that section, you'll see that Murakami Haruki, the novelist, and Kawai Hayao, the Jungian psychotherapist, and D.T. Suzuki used the image of going down a well, plunging down into a deep well, deeper and deeper and deeper, to explore all the phases of the unconscious mind. And we'll see that for Kawai Hayao, the Jungian psychologist, he realizes in the end that Suzuki's Rinzai Zen leaps over the psychological levels of mind in Freudian psychology or even Jungian psychology and goes to a new depth, goes to the bottom of the well. So, to get us started, I thought I'd show you a brief video. You know, in 2006, there was a very wonderful documentary film called The Zen Life, D.T. Suzuki. Have any of you seen this? Well, for a while, for about 2 weeks, it was streaming free on YouTube, but somebody pulled it. However, I'm going to show you the trailer. It's just 1 minute and 45 seconds. It'll be a good springboard for our discussion. It's good to see him and hear his voice and some people's comments about him. All right, so let's watch the video.
This small, gentle man, D.T. Suzuki, is credited with introducing Zen to the West. Zero and infinity, life, and death are one and the same. Reality, as we perceive it, is an illusion. So is the concept of our self. This philosophy is impossible to explain, he said. Yet he wrote about Zen and Buddhism in more than 100 books. And often lectured to Western audiences. Many renowned thinkers, artists, theologians, and psychologists were strongly affected by his teachings.
He's probably the most culturally significant Japanese person in international terms in all of history.
He just made Buddhism burst like a bomb on America.
If you read his books carefully, they're filled with the most profitable kind of doubt.
The first part of my very long paper deals with planetary trauma of ecological crisis through destruction of nature. Can you hear me okay? Yes. My voice has been shot for the last few weeks, so bear with me. For Suzuki, this planetary trauma is caused by dualistic separation from nature, so it appears outside of us, and so we can exploit it for its natural resources. Just something to be used for human use. So he says the answer to that is Satori, as non-dual vision of nature. So we're part of nature, and nature is part of us. He'll call this, following F.S.C. Northrop, the undivided aesthetic continuum of nature. So his solution is for this alternate structure in his ecological vision of nature is the Huayan Buddhist philosophy of Inner's net. Have you heard of that? Suzuki was a great scholar of Huayan Buddhism. This is the Indian Avatamsaka Sutra, and he translated a large part of it from Sanskrit, and especially the last chapter. There's a visionary chapter of Avatamsaka Sutra. It's called Ganda Vyuha Sutra. And he also translated from Huayan Zi, the Chinese, classical Chinese text on Huayan Buddhism. It's called Avatamsaka in India, Huayan in China, and the Japanese Kegon Kyo. So from the Indian, Sanskrit, the Chinese, and the Japanese tradition, he's translating and giving commentary. So he says he wants to give an ecological view of nature. And I'll show it first in the metaphysics of Indra's net, the ethics of Indra's net, and the aesthetics of Indra's net. So drawing from his original sources, Suzuki says, in Satori, you acquire a panoramic and kaleidoscopic and holographic vision of nature as Indra's net. Indra's net, it's like this web of life where in the intersection, in the lattice work of this net, there's so many pearls or diamonds. And he says, yes, each of these multifaceted jewels is reflecting the cosmos from its own point of view as a multiplicity in unity and unity in multiplicity. In Indra's net, all things in nature are interconnected, interdependent, and interrelated, and interpenetrating and interfusing. He says, this can be described through many famous metaphors from Avatamsaka Sutra, but I'll just stay with one, nature as a hall of mirrors. Now he says, just imagine, visualize that everything in nature, the plants, the trees, the stones, everything is like a mirror reflecting totality from its own perspective as a microcosm of the macrocosm. So no simple location, but everything is everywhere at all times. It's a matrix or grid or web or net in which everything is interconnected, interdependent, interrelated. He says, to imagine this kind of fantastic vision, this panoramic and holographic and kaleidoscopic, somewhat psychedelic vision of nature as internet and the Hall of Mirrors, he says, he often quotes from this poem by William Blake. You must have heard it before. You know this poem? He says, see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wild flower, infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. And he said, that's why in Buddhism, its Western counterpart. So, he says, this metaphysics of total interpenetration and interconnection of one and many, as visualized by Indra's net, has a powerful aesthetic and an ethical component. Now he says the ethics of nature as Indra's net is an ethics of metta, kindness, and karuna, jihi in Japanese, compassion, and ahimsa, non-violence, non-injury, non-harm. And so he emphasizes, when you don't see nature as something separate and outside you, but everything is interconnected in a web of life, then you have spontaneous compassion for all things. And he then leads to, let's say, a compassionate ethics of animal welfare. You know, E.T. Suzuki and his American wife, Beatrice Lane Suzuki, they had their own zoo. Not really a zoo, a kind of animal welfare shelter. They called it jihien in Japanese, jihien, a mercy shelter. And from all over, they collected dogs and cats and birds and every kind of animal. And they nursed them back to health and they cared for it. And there's some wonderful essays that he wrote on animal welfare. James Dobbins has a fantastic article about this. And he says, in the web of Indra's net, there's a chain of compassion between us and all life, including all animal life. And so it is incumbent upon us to care for our animals. It's something like Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, where he says in similar words that there's a commandment upon us to be kind and compassionate to all living things and to treat all living things as if they have equal moral consideration, not because they're rational, autonomous agents, but because they can suffer, because they can feel pain. There's many wonderful pictures of E.T. Suzuki doing meditation with cats and dogs and birds all over him from his animal shelter. Then he says, okay, this in turn leads to an aesthetic dimension of nature as Indra's net. He says that the Japanese Zen Buddhists and Mahayana Buddhists, they developed a very aesthetic concept of nature, an artistic and poetic and creative view of nature. But he says, maybe I'll read you a brief passage. He says to comprehend this aesthetic view of nature, you have to grasp the Hua Yen of a Tamsaka Kegon flower reef school structure of nature, an undivided aesthetic continuum with the pattern of Indra's net, where everything is reflecting everything else from its own point of view. Let me read you a quotation. This is from his chapter on the Zen law of nature. Zen law of nature from Zen and Japanese culture written in the 60s. But he's developing this from the 1920s in his essays on Zen Buddhism, before this explosion of environmental philosophy that happened decades later. So listen here, he says, here we must remember that the experience of mere oneness is not enough for the real appreciation of the aesthetic appreciation of nature. It's not a monolithic universe. He says, the balancing of unity and multiplicity, the interpenetration, the merging of self and others, as in the philosophy of the Avatamsaka, Kegon, or Huayan Buddhist school, is absolutely necessary to the Zen aesthetic understanding of nature. There's many passages like that. So he says, through the total interpenetration of one and many, in the interest of this undivided aesthetic continuum of nature, everything in nature is not separate or isolated, but it's a multifaceted jewel mirroring all the other jewels and the web as a whole, as a unity and multiplicity and unity. That's, even in the West, an old formula for beauty. Maximum plurality and multiplicity and variety and unity. Now, he goes on to say, once you see this Avatamsaka vision of Indra's net, where everything is interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent, then you have to adopt what he calls the wabi lifestyle. You know this idea of wabi? The beauty of simplicity and frugality and spiritual poverty. They call it the wabi zumai. It's not just an aesthetic value, but it's a wabi lifestyle of total simplicity. And he says that's the natural antidote to the environmental crisis based on over-consumerism, exploitation of nature. Let me read you this passage. You'll see the connection. Zen proposes to respect nature and to love nature, to live its own life. Zen recognizes that our nature is one with objective nature. In this sense, nature lives in us and we in nature, total interpenetration of subject and object. Zen asceticism advocates wabi-sabi, minimalistic lifestyle of simplicity, frugality, spiritual poverty, making no attempt to utilize nature for selfish purposes or exploit it for its natural resources. So he says, when you have this fantastic panoramic and kaleidoscopic and holographic vision of nature as Indra's net, in an undivided aesthetic continuum, then he says, each jewel in Indra's net, anything in nature, becomes a mirror reflecting totality from its own perspective as a microcosm of the macrocosm, thereby to multiply the beauty, the majesty, the splendor, and the glory of the universe ad infinitum. Now, very interesting. He connects up this idea of the minimalistic, aesthetic lifestyle of wabi-sabi, as exemplified by the tea ceremony, he says. It's connected with a kind of ethical aesthetic directive called just enough. Now, in the Ryoanji, the famous Kyoto temple of the sand garden, and the water basin, in a very imaginative way, 4 characters are written. We, ware, tada, taru, ushiru. I know what just enough is. And he explains, this means, I know what just enough is a kind of Buddhist middle way, or an Aristotelian golden mean between extremes of excess, right, excess and deficit. So he says, when we live this aesthetic wabi-sabi lifestyle of simplicity. It has this moral directive just enough. When we take from nature, you don't take too much, but you don't take too little. You take just enough. For what you need, you give back whatever you take. Ware, tada, taro shino. I know just enough, yes. So, with this, he gives a very systematic, coherent presentation of nature as Indra's net, having both a metaphysics and an ethics and an aesthetics of total interpenetration between one and many. And this, it reminds me very much like the Bible of a lot of environmental philosophy in the West. Do you know Aldo Leopold's 1949 book, A Sand County Almanac? See, he extends ethics beyond the human community to the biotic community of living nature, an extension of ethics into an environmental ethics for the first time really clearly stated. And then he develops an ecological vision of nature as interconnected, based on a land ethics and a conservation aesthetics. All right then. After that, I go on to another kind of trauma, and that's a psychological and existential trauma, which for Suzuki, he says it's caused by a disconnection, a separation from our own unconscious mind. And so that's the origin of trauma, he says, and the cure is by establishing a reconnection with our deeper self, our unconscious psyche. So that's where we're going to go next. Oh, I hope you're following me so far. Yes, for Suzuki, trauma is caused by, psychological trauma, existential trauma is caused by separation, dualistic separation from our unconscious. And so the solution, the cure, is satori, which he says is instantaneous realization of the cosmic unconscious. So I'll explain that. He says by the unconscious, he doesn't mean Freud's personal or individual unconscious as repressed instincts. And he says also, he doesn't mean even Jung's wider collective unconscious of archetypal images. He says we have to go deeper. In Zen Satori, you go beyond that into the cosmic unconscious. Dochiteki Muishiki. And he says the cosmic unconscious of Zen Buddhism is emptiness, non-ego, and absolute nothingness. And as absolute nothingness, he says, it's the fountain, the wellspring of inexhaustible creativity and the source of all the Zen-influenced arts. And he says, so the cure for all trauma will be connecting back with the source of our inherent, spontaneous, creative, aesthetic, unconscious psyche. Now, it's very interesting. In Buddhist terms, he says, here he's quoting from Jung. You know, Jung, in his commentary on Buddhist text, he said, Sigmund Freud's individual unconscious of repressed instincts, that's what in Buddhism is called nirmanakaya, the physically embodied Buddha. But Jung brags, he says, well, my own unconscious, collective unconscious goes far beyond that. It's sambhogakaya. Sambhogakaya, the enjoyment body. And he says, this is the mundus imaginalis, the intermediate imaginary realm of images, of visions, of myths, of hallucinations, delirium, of pictures, of dreams. And it goes far beyond personal unconscious of Freud. However, D.T. Suzuki always makes it clear in Zen Satori, we don't realize the personal unconscious of Freudian psychoanalysis, nor do we realize the collective unconscious of our place, postulated by Jungian analytical psychology. But we go straight to the cosmic unconscious of absolute nothingness, the fountainhead of all creative aesthetic impulses. Now here, I'm not making too many references to Western thinkers because of time restrictions, but here, I'd like to point out a very interesting connection to one of the greatest of Sigmund Freud's disciples. Otto Reh, have you heard of him? First disciple was Jung, who broke off, and then Alfred Adler, who broke off, and his third major disciple and apostle was Otto Reh. Now, Otto Reh wrote his masterpiece in the 1930s. It's called Art and Artists, Creative Impulse and Personality Development. Very close to Suzuki on a lot of points. He says, psychological trauma, such as neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia, it's not a failed sexuality, as said by Freud. It's a failed creativity. So he says that the neurotic exhibiting psychopathological symptoms is a failed artist. And so to heal trauma, you must reconnect with what he calls the creative will of the deeper unconscious psyche. And he said the goal of his psychotherapy, Otto Reh's psychotherapy, is the merging of psyche and cosmos as a microcosm of the cosmos, coincidentia positorum. So both Suzuki and Otto Reh, they say, yes, you have to overcome trauma by re-establishing your direct contact with the creative unconscious. Now, you know, one of the most influential books that Suzuki wrote in the 1960s with two others was Zen and Psychoanalysis. There's another, even more famous aspect of Otto Reh's psychology. You know, for Otto Reh, the primordial trauma is not the Oedipal trauma, as said by Freud. You know, the sexual tension between parents and a child. He says that's derivative. You know what the primordial trauma is? The birth trauma, the shock of being born into this painful world. Otto Reh says the primordial trauma, cause of trauma, is the birth trauma, which is what he calls anxiety separation from the womb. Anxiety separation from the mother's womb. Well, Suzuki agrees with him to a point. He says, yes, that's right. The primordial trauma is birth trauma, separation from the womb. But he says, not the mother's womb, but Tathagata, the womb of Buddhahood, the creative, generative matrix of the enlightened mind. Now, he criticizes Freudian psychoanalysis, saying, you know, Freud said, okay, in religion, he's an atheist, right? And in his reductive explanation, he says, the so-called religious experience, mystical experience of oneness with the universe, he calls it the oceanic feeling. But he says, no, that's not a spiritual experience or a religious experience or holy or divine or sacred experience. You know what it is? It's infantile return to the mother's womb to escape the pressures of adulthood. Suzuki says, no, that's not quite right. Satori, non-dual Satori, is a return to the womb. But it's not the mother's womb, it's Tathagata Garbha, the womb of Buddhahood. And therefore the cure for trauma, that separation, anxiety from Tathagata Garbha, is to return to Tathagata Garbha, the womb of Buddhahood, which he says in psychological terms is the cosmic unconsciousness of absolute nothingness, the fountainhead of infinite creative potentialities. Okay, so let me go on to the third part quickly. Murakami Haruki, maybe you've read him. He's taught here at UH, and they've had classes here, and he has his office here. He's by far the best-selling author, not only in Japan, but all of Asia. Right? Now, Kawai Hayao, the Jungian psychotherapist, worked closely with Murakami Haruki. Murakami Haruki's novels incorporate Jungian psychology in a major central recurrent way. They wrote a book together. Murakami Haruki goes to meet Kawai Hayao. Another book I want to mention is by David Wills. Brand new book, just came out. What he argues is that the novels of Murakami Haruki, have you read them? Anybody? He says that the central recurrent theme, motif of all of his novels and all of his short stories is trauma and healing. All of his novels are about trauma and healing. The trauma of loss, trauma of abandonment, trauma of violence, of rape, of abuse, the trauma of war. And then he says, yeah, let's talk together about your masterpiece. Kawai Hayao now wants to speak with Murakami Haruki about his major work. It's called, have you read it? Wind Up Bird, a Bird Chronicle, 1996. Nijimaki Dori Kuranikuri. Translated later as Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Now, they agree, your novel, as in all novels, is about going down a well to the deeper levels of the unconscious in order to retrieve repressed traumatic memories and have a cure for trauma by going to the bottom of the well. But here's something that all the English readers all over the world that they totally miss in Murakami's novels if you just read it in English or some other language outside of Japanese. The word for well in Japanese, you know, it's ido. It's like two characters, ido. So, you know, often he'll say, oh, 彼は井戸に落ちた。彼は深い井戸に入りました。He went down a well. Went down a deep well. But the word for well, ido, is a homonym for the id, Freud's word for the unconscious. In Japanese, it's written in katakana and pronounced ido. So every time in Murakami's novels, he says that he went down a deep, dark well to the depths of his unconscious psyche, journeyed to the underworld. He's saying he descended into the id, the subconscious mind. And there he encounters fantasies, visions, dreams. He encounters ancestor gods and goddesses, archetypal pictures, the land of the dead. And then returns back to the surface of ego conscious, and his novels go up and down the well. But in this novel, it was so revolutionary, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, because instead of a detached observer perspective, now he takes a fully engaged, committed perspective, and he enlarges trauma. He said, in my early works, it was just to heal the trauma of myself and the reader. But now, in this book, he expands it into not only the personal trauma, but the social, the national, the collective, and intergenerational levels of trauma. Well, he goes down to this well and emerges in Manchuria. It was called the Nongunkan incident. This was a totally taboo topic. Nobody discussed this. But Suzuki is, Murakami Haruki is very explicitly in a great length describing the atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers. And the rapes, and the murders, and the tortures, incredible tortures. Absolutely taboo topic. But he said, now I want to shine light on it. This is the national trauma, intergenerational collective trauma of the Japanese psyche. It's been so deeply repressed. And he says, not to heal that, I'm going to go down the well and retrieve these traumatized memories about World War II and the rape of Nanjing, the Nongunkan incident, to bring about healing for the Japanese nation as a collective whole. So that's why the book is considered his masterpiece. Well, to end that, then, Suzuki also talks about going down a well. In his aestheticism, he quotes this well-known poem by the greatest of all tea masters, Senrikyu. And this is a poem about how in the wabi tea ceremony, you experience emptiness, tranquility, and stillness by going down the deep well of the mind. But Suzuki says, yes, through Satori, in Zen Satori, we go down this deep well of mind, but not the personal unconscious of repressed instincts of Freud or Manakaya, nor is it the Sambhogakaya level of the collective unconscious and its archetypal images, but you go down to the cosmic unconscious of nothingness. Now, to conclude this, you see the connection here is that Kawai Hayao was one of those Japanese scholars. He rejected everything from Japan. He just wanted to be a Western Jungian psychotherapist. But then he read Suzuki's introduction to introduction to Zen Buddhism. And Jung has a foreword to that. You create a vacuum in your mind, and the psychically charged archetypal content from the collective unconscious surface into you conscious. You reestablish the totality of yourself as a coincidentally oppository, the union of conscious and unconscious processes. See? So, yes. Suzuki says, of course, his cosmic unconscious is the realm of nothingness. And then that's what Kawai Hayao finally realized. He said in Suzuki's rim-side Zen, it totally jumps over or skips over or leaps over the intermediate zone of images in Freudian and Jungian psychology. It jumps right over this mundus imaginalis, or a realm of imagination and images, into the deeper level of emptiness. Jung speaks of archetypal images, but he doesn't describe the deeper unconscious realm of emptiness, non-ego and nothing. So just to leave you with a kind of, I think, very graphic, dynamic image of this psychology. It's about going down a well, not to the personal or the collective level, but to the cosmic level, the cosmic unconscious of absolute nothingness, which is the fountainhead of all creative possibilities and the source of all the Zen arts. And all trauma of every kind is ultimately healed by tapping the creative aesthetic impulses of our cosmic unconscious. It goes on and on and on, but the living is you. This is a pretty large-sized auditorium, don't you think? What is it, hold 300 people? Well, when D.T. Suzuki came, he participated in 1939, 49, 59, 1964. No auditorium could hold the thousands of people waiting in line to hear him. So you know where he spoke? In our amphitheater. It's right near Sakamaki Hall, our philosophy building. We have our own Roman Coliseum here on campus. It's a kind of large stadium, holds several thousand people. So Suzuki spoke in the amphitheater to a standing room crowd. Oh, Professor Roger Ames, he told me the story, and I liked it so much I wanted to convey it to you. The only place that could hold Suzuki was in our amphitheater, with thousands of people standing room only. Now, sometimes we have some small events there, not much, but the only time I attended an event at that amphitheater was when Bob Dylan came up. We never had these big rock groups, folk groups coming to Hawaii, not to mention our own campus. That's never happened before or after. So that he had just won the Grammy Award for the best album of the year, Time Out of Mind. And he came here and he played it for us. And I was there. And he played to a standing room only crowd. So the point is, Suzuki, DT Suzuki was like a rock star. Who else could fill up that space? We walked out and went to see the stadium at the end of the tour. We thought, well, we should hold our panel there and see if people come and show up. And probably don't show up. Now, one further connection between D.T. Suzuki and Bob Dylan. Amazing Professor Steve Hein. I couldn't bring all 37 of his books. Did you catch that? 37 books in writing war. One of his most fun and interesting and exciting books is called Bargaining for Salvation. Bob Dylan, a Zen master, he wants to show how those existential blues influenced by beatnik Zen Buddhism, the lyrics and the music, Bob Dylan emerged as a kind of Zen master of his time. Shortly thereafter, he won, of course, a Nobel Prize for Literature. So anyway, I can recommend this book, Bargaining for Salvation, Bob Dylan, a Zen Master by our Professor Steve Hein. So that's just one story about D.T. Suzuki attending our East-West Philosophers Conferences here at University of Hawaii in past years. Okay.
The panelists have any questions or comments for each other? We have some time for that.
I have one question to Professor Heine about Suzuki's evaluation of Dogen. Is quite critical, I think. But what is your evaluation? What do you think about why Suzuki was so critical of Dogen?
Can you hear? Okay, I think the question had to do with, since I brought up Dogen towards the end of my talk, Professor Moria is asking about Suzuki's evaluation. Suzuki did not speak too much about Dogen, and when he did, it was somewhat critical. And how do we interpret that? And let me actually combine that a little bit with the history that partly which Steve Oden avoided. So reminiscing myself and thinking back when people sometimes, students sometimes ask me, how did you get into this field? How did you get into this racket of of Zen studies? And for me, growing up in the 1960s, hearing about Japanese culture, having a Sony small transistor radio, seeing the early version of Godzilla on TV, absorbing, in that post-war period, so many aspects of Japanese culture. Haiku is something, we were ingrained in elementary school because it was supposed to be a simple form of poetry that children could learn. And but also the influence of the beat poets, of the folk music, of the protest era, all of that, was kind of one combined entity for me for a long time. And over the course of time, I tried to sort out the different strands of it. I think in terms of, and then in the 1970s, there was a big wave of Dogen studies was starting. The first translations came out from great books were available, and that kind of shifted the paradigm a little bit because Suzuki's approach was very dominant, and he died in 1966. And at that point, I think, my impression is there's a deep sectarianism in the Japanese Buddhist world, including in Zen. So you have the Rinzai school and the Soto school, and Suzuki is associated with the Soto school, even though he was a profound scholar of history, and he translated Vajrayana Sutra and Paramita Sutras, and he knew so much about the history, but maybe the legacy of the kind of sectarian division here, either Rinzai or Soto, came out a little bit in Suzuki's approach. And then I think one advantage is the Western scholarship, American scholarship of Zen, even though we can't possibly have the affinity and the deep knowledge of the traditional text that Japanese scholarship has, because it's not, there's more challenges in the accessibility aspect. But I think we can see more of a panorama, perhaps, and kind of lift up from the sectarian divisions and try to look at the history kind of even-handedly. And so that's my thought on Suzuki. But let me ask you, I'll ask a question for Steve. I think I like the way you brought up Otto Rank, and you referred to his book in the 30s. So a century later, how do you feel about Western psychological interpretations and their connections with Suzuki?
Suzuki was a Zen Chan Mahayana Buddhist scholar. He translated from Sanskrit, from Chinese, from classical and modern Japanese, and gave his commentary, his exegesis. But as an original thinker, I think his greatest contribution was to have formulated a systematic philosophical psychology of the unconscious, by which he interpreted every aspect of Zen and Mahayana Buddhism. I think that was a fantastic accomplishment. But Suzuki also emphasizes again and again, he says, you cannot charge me, as many Western scholars have tried to do, with psychologism, reducing all experience to psychological categories, or idealism. Because he says ultimately, all Zen and Mahayana Buddhist doctrines are based on shunyata, emptiness, nothingness. So he develops a psychology of the unconscious mind, but he says, the Zen concept of mind is mushi, no mind. And no mind is awareness of emptiness, non-ego, and nothingness. That's just the start of an answer.
Based on your talk, I was wondering, did you ever give a course with philosophy of art in this art department? You, with Steve.
You asking me?
Yes.
I teach philosophy of art all the time.
So in the art department, did you ever have a
No,
course?
not in the art department. That would be great to have cross-listing,
Yeah.
but UH doesn't do so much cross-listing. But for sure, I've always wanted that.
That would be wonderful, because the art department is dead now. Bring it to life.
All the time I get graduate students from the art department, and they take some of my courses on East-West comparative aesthetics, and they say, we've never heard anything like this in our art department. What's wrong?
Thanks for the talks. Really enjoyed them. My question's for Steve. I just wanted to push back against this idea that there's straightforward ethical implications from interdependent origination. So your picture, kind of following on from the Huayan, is that the interdependence of the world is like a jeweled net. But I think in other Buddhist traditions, right, it's just a bunch of fire, right? And we're all just burning in it. And I think also if you look at the face of nature, you see all kinds of altruistic behaviors. We also just see the most insane violence, right? So I guess I'm just curious why we should go in for this other view, right? Like the line from a descriptive analysis of the face of nature to the derivation of an ethical injunction about how we should behave, that looks like something that we want to anchor in reason, not just in like reading off from like, if I have a vision of interdependence, that doesn't automatically get me compassion. Because if I look at the way in which nature is interdependent, I can show you just as much altruistic behavior as I can show you parents literally eating their children. So I think we need an extra step in there in the arguments to get to a kind of Buddhist ethics of compassion from the starting point of metaphysics of dependent origination. Can you say a bit about that?
I can. Well, first, I'm not reading anything into Suzuki, but I was citing or paraphrasing his own views that from a metaphysics of total interconnectedness, interdependence, interrelatedness of Indra's net, and the undivided aesthetic continuum of nature, he wishes to further articulate an ethics of compassion, karuna, and metta, kindness, and ahimsa, nonviolence. All of which he breaks in his writings on samurai Zen, by the way. And the role of reason. Now, he says, whereas in rationality, the level of ego consciousness, you have the realm of discrimination, intellectual discrimination. And then, when you go into the subconscious mind, then you have the realm of non-discrimination. But he says the cosmic consciousness, if he can say it in paradoxical terms, is the realization of undiscriminated discrimination or discriminated undiscrimination. So their reason is involved. And it's not just an intuitive grasp of interrelatedness between all things, but he says we also must rely on the norms of cognitive reason at the level of intellectual discrimination and combine them. So he's not a total irrationalist as sometimes claimed by his critics. So that's a great question, Sean. Well, let me just leave it there. It's only a partial response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentations. Usually when we read about Suzuki, in the same breath we also read about Sasaki and Senzaki. Is there a reason for this conversion?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So the word Suzuki usually is mentioned simultaneously with Sasaki and Senzaki. Is there a reason for this convergence of the three individuals?
Perhaps I can answer that. You mean Sasaki is Sasaki Zen master in New York?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Senzaki also a Zen master.
Right, in Los Angeles. They are from the same monastery in Kamakura called Engakuji, and studied under Shaksoen. So I think they are about the same age. So that's why they are mentioned at the same time. And what would you like to ask more about?
So is there a philosophical convergence among these three?
I think they follow the Shaksoen's lineage. So in that sense, they have the same understanding or the similar understanding of Rinzai Zen. But I think the characteristics differs. So their stress on Suzuki is more philosophical person, whereas Sasaki and Senzaki were more like practitioner oriented, because they were both in New York and Los Angeles teaching Zen Buddhism to Americans. That was very interesting, because they were there in the 1920s and 30s when Zen was not really like boom. And so they started from the scratch, to teach Zen Buddhism to Americans.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the first question about whether interdependence gives us a kind of ethic, metta, ethics, or compassion. think there's a sense in which it does, in which we experience ourselves as part of nature and feel compassion for the suffering of the creatures in it. But I find myself with a real problem, and I want to describe it experientially. I live in New York City, so one of my main relations to nature is walking in Central Park. And I love to watch the squirrels. I also love to watch the hawks. And sometimes I come upon the hawk tearing apart the squirrel. I assume the squirrel felt intense fear and suffering before that. And so I feel compassion for the suffering of the squirrel. But then I ask myself, if I have an ethics of compassion, then I want to do something. I want to stop the suffering. But if I were trying to prevent the suffering of the squirrel, I would be causing suffering to the hawk. And there doesn't seem a way around that. I have to accept the suffering of both creatures precisely because they are interdependent. And so this interdependence doesn't necessarily leave me with an ethic of compassion by which I can take that compassion into practice.
So going back to the first part of my paper, I'll talk about this in terms of an environmental ethics. D.T. Suzuki has much in common with the deep ecology of Arnie Ness. And he says the trauma, planetary trauma, of ecological destruction of nature, it's because we objectify nature. We have separation from nature as something external to ourselves, as a materialistic, consumeristic, reductionistic, mechanistic, egocentric, and anthropocentric standpoint. And he says what we have to do is have a seismic shift from egocentrism and anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, to biocentrism, where you value all living things in the interconnected web of life, and beyond that to a fully ecocentric perspective, where you value the land, the earth, Gaia, the entire biosphere, the entire ecosystem, the actual habitat. And so one way to think of this is an expansion beyond egocentrism, where you see yourself as separated and isolated, and therefore you can always act in a self-interested, selfish point of view. But he says, from the standpoint of this vision of nature as internet, where everything is interconnected, interrelated, interdependent, then it places a commandment upon us to care for all things with compassion and kindness and nonviolence. But that's Suzuki's standpoint. So maybe he's making a leap from the metaphysical to the ethical, but he feels it's an important leap to try to make.
I would like to ask a different question. The scholar Gu Mingdong recently published an article in the Journal of Tsinghua University, where he argues that Chinese Zen Buddhism, or Chinese Zen, actually is not a part of Buddhism, a branch of Buddhism. It should be regarded as an independent new religious school. His argument is on three main reasons. The first is that Zen's overall attitude towards the Buddha, towards Buddhist scripture, is entirely different from any religious tradition towards their ancestors. And the second, Chinese Zen has a very deep connection with Chinese Taoism, Laozi and Zhuangzi, I think which is a fact. Third, he also argues that Chinese Zen emphasizes self-salvation, which kind of resembles the Chinese tradition of Confucianism. So altogether, he argues that Chinese Zen is not part of Buddhism. It's kind of a mix of different things and standing on its own. I would like to ask
Okay,
the expert
okay.
panel.
Stop there. I could briefly say something that I'd like Professor Hunt to respond to.
First, let me finish. Yeah, and if he's right, we know he's right. Whether you think Suzuki actually brought Zen back to Buddhism. So two parts of the question. The first is on Umindosa argument. The second is my question about whether you think whatever, Umindosa said, if he's right, and at least Suzuki did something significant in that one. Thank you.
Okay, I'll briefly respond. First of all, the very first thing that Suzuki did when he came to America was translate Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. And he was a great specialist in translating Chinese Taoist texts of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu. And often he identifies Wu Shi no mind as the collective unconscious with Wu Wei, spontaneous and naturalness of Taoism. And also, he always traces back the Japanese tradition of Zen Buddhism to Chinese Chan Buddhism. In English, of course, he has his book, The Zen Doctrine of No Mind, which is his partial translation and commentary on Huineng's Platform Sutra. And he always emphasizes this is the starting point for Zen in Japan. So always he's giving full 100% credit to the Chinese Chan Buddhist tradition, which he totally is immersed in as a translator and an interpreter. So yes, the Zen Doctrine of No Mind is a great book to understand D.T. Suzuki's psychological interpretation, reinterpretation of the Chan Buddhist tradition springing from Huineng's Platform Sutra.
Yes, I agree that I think Suzuki's legacy is that he tries to show the uniqueness of Zen and its basis in Chinese Chan, and he did translate and interpret many of the Chan texts that influenced Japanese Zen, but he wants to show the uniqueness, that it stands out above its influences, but he also wants to show the deep rootedness in those influences in Taoism and in traditional Buddhist and Mahayana scriptures. And I think there was a tendency in Meiji era Japan to find the roots of Zen and the roots of contemporary Japanese Buddhism in India, in Southeast Asia, and there was a lot of interaction in those realms. I think on the broader question of, if I understood the question, is Chan really a part of Buddhism, or does Chan stand on its own? I mean, one way to look at it is that throughout all of history, there are forms of intellectual or cultural or artistic developments that reach a certain pinnacle that can't be accounted for by their predecessors or by their influences, and we value and cherish those because of that unique standing. On the other hand, they're all derived from some historical influence. And if you look at the Chinese Chan text, I mean, they were written in a way that the literati, in particular, the literati class, which was well schooled in Confucianism, also knew Taoist texts, but also knew music, painting, art, calligraphy very well. That's the class of people that the Chan texts were written for. So I think Confucianism and Taoism and Chinese poetry and arts were very much embedded in Chan. We can't really separate it. But can I ask one question for Professor Tomoe?
I'm sorry.
Actually, let's do it. We'll have to close with that, but I'm sorry that.
Okay, so we're closing with this question to Professor Tomoe.
Okay, right. So one of the interesting things of your paper was when you talked about Suzuki and the distinction between Seishin, spirituality, and Lei Sei, which could also be translated as spirituality, but avoided the political implication. That I think is your point, right? So can you sum up your view of Suzuki, because so much criticism has come out? Like, how would you sum up your view of Suzuki and the political implications?
Thank you. That is a good question.
my point is that he was not pro-Nazi, as someone said, but I think he was. Okay, so because of the ambiguity of his writings and expressions, he doesn't clearly said he is anti-war during the war time, because it was there was a time of high censorship. So he had to be careful to what to say at that time. But at the same time, in his writing, he was very careful. But when he gave a lecture to his students, he said, come back and do not sacrifice yourself to the nation. You have to return to Japan, to us. And then that was the most exceptional things that at that time the teachers would tell their students, because at that time all the teachers in Japan told their students to sacrifice yourself to emperor, and he never said that. So that is those things gives you a different aspect of Suzuki becoming more. Actually, inside his ideas and inside he was anti-war, but it was very difficult to express openly in public. That's my idea.